Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Shawn Griffiths.
And if you are one of the majority of Americans who is tired of voting for the lesser of two evils, and if you are one of the majority of Americans who feels we need more and better choices on the ballot, we feel two parties are too few, and talk about the dysfunction of our current system and how we can fix it. Over the last 2 weeks, Vice President Vance and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth went full roast mode on European allies at the Munich Security Conference over internal politics and defense spending, while Donald Trump argued that Ukraine never should have started the war with Russia, no doubt referring to the open hostility Ukrainians displayed towards Russian troops who entered their sovereign territory and began shooting at them. This represents an about-face from Biden's approach towards America's alliance with Europe, which represented an about-face from Trump's approach in his first term, which represented an about-face from Obama's, which represented an about-face from Bush's. You get the idea. With America entering an era that can best be described as ping-pong diplomacy 2.0, no one should be surprised to find many abroad questioning whether the U.S. is a reliable partner. We're going to discuss the recent history of U.S. foreign policy, how it's shifted with the rise in polarization at home, and how we might be able to make U.S. policy more stable and create fewer WTF moments at major international conferences. But first, so Shawn, I want to talk about the Where's Shawn poll, but as we've come to see, the second Trump administration is about as volatile as the first, and we've got some news to share. So it's first off, to set the stage, it's Friday, February 21st. A lot may change from now till when we publish the episode on Monday. But Shawn, why don't you give us the scoop, because you're the one who brought it up to me.
Yeah, so right now there are some news agencies that are reporting this, although there's nothing guaranteed or set in stone with this because it's based off comments from White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who during CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, said that Zelensky is ready to sign a mineral deal that would give the U.S. Ownership of 50% of mineral production in Ukraine.
You know, when I first heard the news, one of the ways I processed it was, well, foreign policy over the years has been filled with backroom dealings and deals that work to the advantage of one party or not the other. But I think the one thing that can't be understated is the fact that America is not the only country supporting Ukraine in this war. There are European powers as well that are contributing to the war effort. So the question is, if the U.S. is getting 50% of Ukraine's rare earth minerals, then what does Europe get?
Right. And it's not like Europe hasn't contributed a lot. They do have an invested interest in Ukraine's protection, given that they share the same continent. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. 100%. You know, one of the things you and I were talking about prior to this news breaking was Trump's foreign policy shift. Mm-hmm. And really how it raises the question, is the U.S. a reliable international partner when our foreign policy could do a 180 every 4 years, right? So this isn't necessarily a Trump thing. This isn't a Biden thing. This is just the fact that due to the nature of American government, foreign policy can change very rapidly and very drastically. Right. And we've seen this in overdrive with Trump, who thinks nothing of shredding alliances, existing treaties, so on and so forth. And so prior to this announcement, Trump had initiated peace talks with Russia, really sidelined European allies and Ukraine for that matter. He openly criticized Zelensky. I thought one of the most interesting statements to come out of this week was when he said Zelensky had a 5% approval rating. Mm-hmm. Did you hear that story?
Yeah.
So Trump said Zelensky had a 5% approval rating. Then there was, I can't remember whether it was the AP or some other news site, said, no, it's actually closer to 50%. And the only question I have is, like, who's taking a poll in Ukraine right now?
Right.
And more importantly, who's answering that? Like, could you imagine like somebody sitting there, like rockets flying in the background? Like, so regarding President Zelensky's performance, do you strongly approve, somewhat approve, neither approve nor disapprove? I mean, like we couldn't even forecast Pennsylvania,
Hmm.
in the last election. So I don't understand how we're getting such clear data.
Yeah, it's weird, and to speak to the whole theme of this conversation being, is the U.S. a reliable ally in geopolitical affairs? The quote that stuck out to me came from Trump when he's told Zelensky, "You need to make a deal now, or you won't have a country left." This is more strong arming by the Trump administration that seems to favor a Russia alliance more than it does a Ukrainian alliance, because it's basically saying, "Hey, take my deal for these mineral rights, or we aren't going to stop Russia from continuing to push more and more if they want to into your country."
The one thing that's consistent about Trump is that he's transactional. A lot of this can be expected from Trump. This is exactly who he's always been. The interesting thing here, though, that I saw was just how divided Republicans are on this, right? So this isn't something that was warmly received by everybody. And I think you've got a mix of people who were opposed to what Trump said, who were the maybe like what I like to call the "I didn't read that yet" crowd, like the people who don't want to agree with him but don't want to openly disagree with Trump. And then you've got the full on dyed in the wool MAGA crowd, Trump can do no wrong. But, it's very clear that within the Republican Party, there's a split between the traditional hawks who are very supportive of NATO, very suspicious of Russia, and the sort of isolationist MAGA crowd that favors a more transactional approach.
And to your point about Trump being a transactional type of president, wanting to get something for something, you have to wonder, how much concern does he have for the future of his own party? Because as you've talked about, we have seen a divide in the Republican Party over this. A lot of senators like Murkowski and Collins and even Thune, the Senate Majority Leader now, has come out and refuted his comments about Ukraine, because, for one, the U.S. has been an ally of Ukraine for a long time. And two, for even longer, I would say Russia has been considered a bad actor in the geopolitical stage.
Well, absolutely. I think what's clear from Europe's reaction is that they're really starting to think about life without the United States. Macron just had a summit with European leaders absent the US. And look, the reality is, and this, something you said earlier, this is a much bigger national security issue for Europe than it is for the US. They have as much of a right to pursue their own interests as the United States does. And there's no reason the US should get mad if this is the new environment we're living in. However, this is not the environment the majority of Americans want or the majority of Americans voted for. And
Right.
so if you look at public opinion on NATO and on the war in Ukraine, what you see is a super majority of Americans, 63%, according to the latest poll by Pew, support U.S. membership in NATO. It's a slight decline, so it was 66% in 2024, but not a lot, right? Now, when you break that down by party, 47% of Republicans feel that way. So a
Mhm.
minority, but not a small minority. Democrats much stronger, and independents much stronger as well. And so the United States as a country values NATO, wants to remain in NATO, but Trump doesn't need the entire country. I mean, first off, it's his second term. He doesn't need any voters. Even prior to winning the last election, he didn't need every voter in order to win.
I think it's worth also pointing out that support for NATO has been on the decline over the last decade. One of the biggest drops that we saw was between 2019 and 2022, when there was a 10-point drop from 77% to 67%.
Mhm.
However, where that drop is entirely with Republicans. They're what are driving those numbers down. And it's because you have at least 77% of Republicans that are on board with what Trump is doing. And so they're buying into the narrative that we are paying all this money into NATO and getting no benefit from it while they're taking advantage of us. And so I think right now you're seeing Republicans get on board with what Trump is saying, which is driving down those numbers. But yes, I think when you look at what the majority of Americans want, they do support NATO, but also when you do look at polling, a majority of Americans want us to focus more on domestic issues, which, to your point, getting back to this election, what Americans voted for was for Trump and Congress to do something about the economy. And so far, that has not been a priority.
Absolutely. And now, ahead of this conversation, I actually went back because I wanted to find some historical parallels. And I wanted to get a feel for when was it that the wheels fell off the wagon with the United States. And now what's interesting is if you go back not too far, so you go back 50 years, Nixon made a very bold and controversial move when he normalized relations with China. And I guess if we want to make a parallel to Trump in a very transactional fashion, this was designed to counter Soviet influence during the Cold War, but it was not without its skeptics. We go a little further. We go to Reagan's arms control treaties in the 80s with Mikhail Gorbachev, premier of the Soviet Union. This was something that was not warmly accepted by everybody in his party. A lot of Republican hardliners really opposed this, but he was able to get bipartisan support. And ultimately, that was a lasting policy. And I think the thing about both of those moves that we should emphasize is there was bipartisanship. Both presidents built consensus around the policy. Now that changes. So when we get into the tail end of the Clinton administration, this is a point where political polarization has started to rise. Cooperation between parties has started to decline. Clinton enters the Kyoto Protocol, which was aimed at reducing greenhouse gases. This was something that he could not get put through Congress. So it was not ratified by the Senate. So as a result, in 2001, George W. Bush withdraws. Now, the thing I'll highlight here is that very often the way this is portrayed is Republicans walked away from this. Republicans walked away from Kyoto, or Republicans walked away from the Paris Climate Accord, for example, right? That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that a Democratic president didn't get buy-in. Because if we look at the Paris Climate Accord, he did not get that ratified. He did not get buy-in from Congress. So Obama signs a treaty and Trump walks away from it because he doesn't have to stick to it because it wasn't ratified by Congress. And I think if we want to look at the holes in American foreign policy and we want to understand why it is that we don't seem to be as reliable as we once were, it's because a lot of foreign policy, like a lot of policy in general now, is dictated from the White House. Nothing gets through Congress. And so as a result, that policy is only as good as long as that party holds the presidency.
Yeah, it really goes back to our discussion on executive orders from a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. Our foreign policy isn't reliable because really nothing is reliable in Washington these days as a result of this divide that we've seen between the parties that's just growing and growing and growing. Everything is increasingly partisan. Everything has to be our way or no way, right? Our way or the highway. And so what you see is every time there's this ebb and flow of power, there's an ebb and flow in policy on just about everything, including our geopolitical responses.
And if we want to look at the consequences of this, to frame it again, this is not a Trump thing. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a Democratic thing. It's simply an issue of consistency. And I think over the last 8 years, we have demonstrated ourselves to be unreliable. Just the fact that we've kind of done a 180 on Ukraine and decided to embrace Russia is sending a signal to our allies. And I'd be hard pressed to imagine that anyone in Europe is going to be eager to get involved in any deal with the United States, Democrat or Republican administration, out of fear for what'll happen.
Yeah, the message that we see on Ukraine is startling because we already talked about this. There's very little bipartisanship that goes on these days. one of the few things that was a lasting bipartisan agreement when it came to anything foreign relations wise was our alliance with the Ukraine, particularly in the struggle against Russia, because Russia has always been seen as an adversarial government going all the way back to the Cold War.
I think what Trump has revealed is just how much other presidents were acting on good faith. Because every president prior to Trump did try to govern to the entire country. Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, the other Bush, Reagan. And I don't want to say necessarily it's not Trump's fault, but the system allows that to happen.
Yeah, Trump isn't the cause. He is a symptom of the current system in the way that he's exposed just how fragile any sort of good faith argument can be when partisanship plays a huge factor in how any of our leaders in Washington legislate and govern. Yeah, Trump isn't the cause of the problems we see today. He is a symptom of a current system that, by all means, would have eventually led to a leader like him, even if he didn't pop up when he did. And I think unintentionally, what Trump has done is expose the system for how it works, but also illustrate and highlight the dire need to reform a system in which we have a Congress that is completely unresponsive to the needs of the American people and inconsistent with being on the side of the public interest.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that and let's really break it down. So if this is your first time listening, you're going to understand everything. And if this is your second or third time listening, you can just zone out for a bit because you probably heard all this before. But the thing that makes US democracy different from pretty much every other democracy out there is that our electoral system more or less prohibits all but two parties. And both the Democratic and Republican parties are comprised of the largest political minorities. So, what do I mean by that? Neither party, in and of itself, has enough voters to win elections. They both hover around a third of all voters, right? Remainder are independents who are voting either out of maybe some partial alignment with one of the two major parties or voting out of antipathy for one of the other major parties, which is more often than not what we see here. So when we get into the coalition that makes up the Republican Party, we have a mix of Christian conservatives, we have a mix of nationalists. This is really what you'd consider, the core MAGA crowd. These are voters that Trump brought into the party. And then you've got your kind of old guard, pro market, hawkish Republicans that are kind of a dying breed, or at least they've been sidelined. And Trump understands he can exercise control over his party as long as he has the Christian wing and as long as he has the nationalist wing. And he uses that as a way to threaten the careers of every other Republican out there.
And it's important when you look at how these political groups, these ideological groups break up, is that when you look at MAGA, they make up maybe a quarter, maybe 30% of the actual Republican base. But the thing is that these are the voters who show up in primaries.
And to put some real numbers behind that, Trump won his nomination in both 2016 and 2024 with approximately 10% of all registered voters. So he won a majority of support amongst his own party, but that was only 10%. And polling in the run up to the last election showed 70% of people didn't want him on the ballot, but he didn't need 70%. He just needed that core 10%. If you look at the Republican coalition, those nationalists I talk about 30% of all Republicans, 10% of all voters. Christian conservatives, 25% of the Republican Party, 8% of all voters. So Trump doesn't need a majority of Americans. He just needs a majority of Republicans. And he knows that. And he also knows that every other member of Congress needs that as well. Because if we look at, and we'll just take the House, over 80% of House seats are safe seats. That means the majority of Republicans in Congress, and Democrats for that matter, rely on primary voters to keep their careers going. So whatever Trump says goes. And this is why it is so hard to find a member of Congress who will contradict what he says, because they know their primary voters will punish them for that.
And that 10% figure is very consistent from what we've seen in the past. In a previous episode, when we talked about the Tea Party, a public opinion poll found that 10% of America actually identified with the Tea Party.
Yeah. And so I think the thing that I want folks to understand, and the thing I think we should be driving home in this conversation, is that if we go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, right? President Trump is taking actions that are contrary to what the majority of Americans think, but are actions that are very popular with Republicans, a political minority. And as a result of this structure, what we see is a great deal of instability and inconsistency in American foreign policy, which has some very serious effects on all Americans, if not the world. If the US is an unreliable ally, fine. If the US wants to isolate itself, fine. But that should be the result of the majority of Americans deciding that's the direction that they want to take. And the reality is, right now, Trump's moves are not popular with a majority of voters. And to add to that problem, Congress is unable to serve as a check on the president because the president has power over primary voters. And those primary voters ultimately dictate whether Republicans stay in Congress or not. So Shawn, this goes back to the episode we did 2 weeks ago. It's the same thing. What the president says goes because Congress is powerless against their base.
And again, to reiterate what we talked about, this affects everything. Foreign policy, domestic policy. And yeah, a lot of Americans want more focus on domestic policy. But if the current system keeps working the way that it has, that further divides our parties while only serving the interest of a minority of Americans rather than the majority, then we're going to continue to see this back and forth inconsistent policy on everything that's going to just increase mistrust in our government institutions and also in our elections.
And so let's go into what can be done or what should be done. And I want to throw out a theory to you, Shawn, because I was thinking about this ahead of this conversation, which is, a lot of blame for the level of polarization, the level of partisanship has been placed on partisan media. And it's been placed on the fragmentation of media, right? So now you don't just have, Fox News. Now you have Fox News, you have Newsmax, you have MSNBC. And then, of course, you have a whole army of podcasters and YouTubers and us. You've got a whole group of political voices out there that are building their own sort of subcultures, political subcultures, right? And this is where people say a lot of this extremism arises. Possibly, yes. But here's another way to look at this. Maybe a system that only allows for two parties is as much of an anachronism as is everybody getting their news from an hour-long broadcast on one of three major networks, right? Which is the way it was before. And I think the issue that we have here is we do have a true diversity of political voices in this country that may be greater than it ever has been before. I don't know that for certain, but I do know that the two parties aren't doing a good job catering to all voices. Because if you break down the electorate into political subgroups, there are about 5 or 6 very distinct political subgroups that don't fit neatly into either of the two major parties. And so very often it's one of those factions that ultimately dominates. In, the case of the Democrats, the Obama wing is still kind of the one that's in control, socially liberal, pro-market. We've already talked ad nauseum about the Republicans, nationalist, Christian. Those are the folks who are in charge there. And I think the issue is these are all subgroups. These are all minorities. And so I really think if we're going to modernize democracy to cater to these new and diverse voices, the answer isn't banning partisan media. The answer isn't regulating social media. The answer isn't reinstating the fairness doctrine. None of these things are going to change the fact that there are a multitude of political voices in this country, and they're not going to change the fact that people are angry. They're not going to change the fact that the system is not working for a lot of people right now.
And people are so disillusioned by the system that they are not engaging the way that they used to. And you talked about how partisan media isn't necessarily a problem. Well, polls show about half of voters don't even pay attention to political news anymore because they're so exhausted by politics in this country. They're so disenchanted by what they see, disenfranchised in many cases because their voices aren't being heard. Only 10% of Americans think that they actually have a voice in Washington to begin with. So, yeah, it's one of those things where you have to address the fact that the system has checked so many people out of the process and also doesn't serve their interests fundamentally. And that would then create an incentive not only for media to be a bit more responsive to the news that Americans want to hear, but also our elected officials to be more responsive to the needs of voters.
And I think beyond that, steering it back to the main topic of this conversation, systems that are comprised of a number of smaller parties govern by coalition. They govern by consensus. They govern by compromise. I think that breaking up the two parties would give Congress more power because it would require that the parties negotiate. The idea that a party with 15% of seats in the House isn't going to negotiate is ridiculous, right? And so I think if we can get back to the point where Congress is negotiating again, we have a check on presidential power. We also have more consistency and consensus when it comes to policy. So when Congress votes yes on a treaty, that yes is a yes, regardless of who's sitting in the White House. All right. You know what, Shawn? I'm capping it there. We never got to your poll. We're going to do that next time when there isn't breaking news. Thank you very much for listening. If you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe. Please be sure to rate it, and please be sure to write a review. The music you are hearing is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you again for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.